David Macaulay. I'm a fan of David Macaulay. I once wanted to do a book with David Macaulay, but it didn't happen. That's his only mark against him, is we couldn't put that package together. Other than that, I love David Macaulay. And I'm in awe of how his mind works. David.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on television. I'm actually, I'm not even at the cutting edge of information technology. I'm sort of at the spatula end. I'm an illustrator, and I illustrate in the old-fashioned way. I illustrate with drawings. 2 years ago, I decided, after 10 years of procrastination, to do a book about the building of a human body. And the goal of the book would simply be to create a structure that was dramatic enough so that the images would stay with you when you came across technical terms, articles about new developments and so on and so forth, and would have some sense of where this was in you. I think that we learn to be complacent and take things for granted very early on, because we are given these extraordinary machines in which to live, with which to live. And we very quickly learn to take them for granted unless something goes wrong. And if you can take this for granted, I mean, it's hardly surprising that you would take a realm of other things with which life must concern itself for granted. So, as an illustrator, I thought I'll use drawings, first of all, to help me learn about the subject matter, which is what I've always done, and secondly, to help me pass on what I've learned in what is hopefully some sort of useful way. Well, that was 2 years ago. And then September 11th happened. 3 days after September 11th, I called my editor and said, I think it's time to do mosque. For those of you who know cathedral and pyramid and castle, you'll know that there's at least one glaring omission from the shelf of middle school libraries across the country, and it's mosque. So I said, I've got to do something. I don't make smart bombs, so maybe I can provide a little bit of information to help chip away at the wall of ignorance that ultimately results in dropping smart bombs. So I've spent the last 2 years building an Ottoman mosque. Finished it on Thursday. I am now back on the drawing board to build a human body. What gives me the credentials to take on a human body? I studied architecture. We who study architecture believe we can solve any problem put in front of us, and it is simply another sort of design problem if that's how I choose to approach it. I've also I've built a cathedral. I've looked at underground systems, understanding the piping and the methods by which we hold things up in space and so on and so forth. I've looked at the coal-fired steam plant of a TVA power plant. I know all about this kind of plumbing stuff, and I've even done some looking at this extraordinary structure. This is the IBM egg from the 1964 World's Fair. You probably remember it. 3 stages of construction. I mean, if I can take on the IBM egg, I'm ready for the human body, I think. And lastly, a brief study of Italian plumbing and electrical engineering has shown me the intricacies of the weaving together of these systems. And so I'm ready. I'm ready to take on the human body. But before I did it, I thought maybe I should look back at an older project and sort of reconsider some of the drawings I did for a project on the brain. Because I may find some clues there that would help me focus more precisely and more efficiently on what it is that might make my contribution to this overburdened field already worth the paper. So, a few years back, I found myself in a morgue with a brain, thanks to the generosity of a surgery instructor at Brown University, and I found myself cutting and making little drawings and wishing that everything was color-coded, and it's not. It's all the same gray, grayish, slightly more gray, less gray, whitish. But the opportunity to sort of see this stuff firsthand, combined with Frank Netter and videos that were being done at the time, computer sections, and the kind of stuff that now seems almost archaic. And we're only talking a few years, but it helped me to begin to put together a series of drawings, the first of which was conceived as a romantic portfolio, primarily just to orient people with the major aspects of the brain. So I wanted this sort of garden in which, and if you have to squint at this drawing to fully understand what it, I mean, just a tired old visual trick, but nevertheless, it seemed like an appropriate place to start a romantic portfolio. In the middle of the garden, we cultivate our brain stem, the reptilian brain, and for those of you who forget that it's a reptilian brain, there's a crocodile in the water. I think these little clues are very helpful. The cerebellum in place on back of the brain stem, the next sort of big part chronologically, and there's a big bass or some sort of fish down, I can't remember what it is now, but an ibis as the limbic system comes into place. The thalami are up there too. These are all labeled, incidentally, in the book, not left blank as you see here, so you don't have to think it all through. A couple of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus coming into play here. The marmot in the lower left-hand corner. I'd never seen a marmot before, so I thought I would include it in the drawing. And here's the left hemisphere coming in for a landing right over the corpus callosum that will help tie the two hemispheres together. So some of the terms that you've just heard may now suddenly have some concrete, for those of you who aren't in the medical business, some sort of more concrete imagery with which to sort of identify. The monkeys are very pleased as the brain is slowly assembled, and it's only at the end of this little romantic portfolio that the brain, being completed, is capable of generating its own light from within. Seemed like a over-the-top romantic way of concluding this little story. The monument on the right-hand side is to Vandeleur, who made those extraordinary drawings, one of which included the rhinoceros wandering through the garden. I thought this is a different approach now. Let's just follow one thing that the brain does, and let's use somebody without a brain, but let's just give him the benefit of the doubt. David. An image enters David's eye. Through the lens, is flipped upside down. Now from this point in the collection of drawings in the book, you have to turn the book upside down because the image itself is going through our brain upside, or apparently upside down. But to avoid, uncomfortable gestures in the audience, I've actually had all the slides reversed, so you don't have to do anything untoward out there. So we sort of move in towards the retina, and then from the retina through the optic nerves to the optic chiasm, we cross over to the sort of to wherever that is, and then the optic radiation that, without the labels I'm lost too. So the optic radiation that sort of carries this message all the way to the visual cortex, the back of the brain, and then the whole idea was to sort of move in closer and closer, following the information, showing the layers of the brain, showing the aspects of the way the cortex has a tendency to sort of favor in areas, left eye, right eye, and so on and so forth. I knew none of this stuff beforehand, and I've forgotten a lot of it since. But the notion of going through this process was tremendously valuable in beginning to develop a kind of sense of the architecture, which is where I felt comfortable. It was still fairly diagrammatic, however. Into a particular cell, we travel down the axon and sort of gradually find our way to the synaptic connections, which you see a couple of here. As we hit a dendrite, and we go into a couple of the synaptic connections beneath the button into the space as the chemicals are released across the space, upset the balance, transfer the message or pass the message across to the receptor cell, and so on and so forth. And David is smiling because Mom has entered the academia. But the one that got me most interested, and it's probably because of my training, and the one that will probably lead me to the human body book more directly is this one, which began in Paris. In part, it was resuscitated at De Gaulle Airport, as you have to sort of wander through all these tubes, becoming some kind of an organism as fundamental and as simple perhaps as a brain cell traveling through some sort of passageway, thinking of myself as someone in the architecture, and then thinking of myself as someone who perhaps could be in a brain. Early sketches, things you've just seen, but now with scaffolding around them and cranes on top of them, which suddenly makes them seem a lot more familiar and friendly to me. Again, a slightly more developed sketch from a different point of view. And eventually, we get to, as we go through these sketches, we get to the process of actually building a brain. You need to build some sort of cavity for it, some sort of structure that will support the brain, a fair amount of scaffolding and whatnot there. But we've chosen a site in a city to build this thing. And there is a cerebella under construction at the background. One of them probably will be used for an auditorium. There is a thalami under construction in the center. The eye, one of them is covered, one of them is not covered at the front. As we move around, we can see the optic nerve now coming out of the back of the eyeball to the optic chiasm where the information splits and the wires basically split. The caudate the hippocampal gyrus, that funny thing that looks like a paw, the hippocampus that sort of sweeps up, the amygdala. The other side of the brain is used for different things, but this is the side that will remain open to some extent so you can actually see these structures more easily. The structure continues to grow, of course, assuming alarming proportions. The nasal cavity is the perfect place for a library. Opening day, about 500 school buses all show up at the same time, and the doors all open, and the occupants of the school buses race for the brainstem, which of course is the main circulatory system, entry system into the brain museum. So you get on those elevators, and you come up the hippocampus, up the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, one of those two larger spaces in the brain, and you come up these people mover escalator combination things alongside the choroid plexus, which is producing cerebrospinal fluid, which, for the benefit of museum goers, I have removed. But also, because of that sort of shiny white surface on the hippocampus, it's a terrific place to get a little doormat, that kind of thing that you might use on a helter-skelter, and slide back down and do that a few times, just get it out of your system. And then you're ready to move into the big space. And here we are, moving up the atrium of the lateral ventricle and into the main body of the lateral ventricle. The corpus callosum runs across the top. The caudate nucleus is that big sloping surface on the left-hand side. A good place for the caudate cafe, which is where you would take a little breather here. You've made quite a trip already. Perhaps have a drink, take some photographs. Before heading down into the third ventricle, which is on the center line of the brain between the two lateral ventricles, beneath the arch of the fornix, along with these four runaways from the Grand Canyon who seem to be making the same journey. There'd be many ways of traveling around the brain. And so this sort of seemed logical. But, if you can be there, you sort of wander down now into the third ventricle, and you can see the main connection between the two thalami, that dark shape on top. And the little stairway that goes up at the back goes up to the pineal recess, which in ancient times was considered the seat of the soul, but in my museum is just restrooms. Another way of making this trip, you don't have to come up through the lateral ventricle. You can also come through the eye and exit through the optic nerve and have a sort of completely different perception. Here we are behind, beneath the optic nerve, or both optic nerves actually. We're sort of standing on this place below the optic chiasm. You can see an aneurysm growing on the internal carotid artery on the left-hand side. So many fascinating things. Now you're asking yourself, this is ridiculous. How do you pay for something like this? Well, my solution, with all those fissures in the walls, there's lots of room for dwellings. So these are little balconies that belong to cortical condos that would be sold. That'd be quite expensive. This is an urban setting. And the only problem with it is that it's tough to hang pictures. That was the only problem I could foresee. So anyway, I was looking at these and thinking about these, and I do believe that getting inside this thing, being able to walk around it and feel how things might be connected. Now this is something completely different, obviously, from the body, where I can watch the construction of a knee joint. I can show you how one bone is being slipped into another bone, and how and why, and which bones rotate and which bones just move back and forth, and that sort of stuff. But if I can capture some sense of the drama of this, then I have a feeling that the images might have a better chance of staying with the reader, and in that sense being useful somewhere down the road. So this is for the TED Med 7 presentation. This is the terrible introduction because all there is just two little sketches. But basically what you will see in this vast field is the beginnings of the construction of the human body. So that's what I'm doing. Thank you.
I mean, I think that's just remarkable. Just remarkable.